In this month's First Person podcast, I sat down with Will, Pierson, and Rob, and we talked about games as service versus games as products. I'm Betsy Bray. You can find me on Twitter at Betsy Bray.
I'm at Robot Parking on Twitter. Also, if you would like to follow First Person Scholar, it's at FPS Weekly on the Twitters.
His name is Rob. He's the managing editor.
I'm the managing editor. Hello.
My name is Pierson, and I'm still really mad about Tin to Peach halves.
I'm Will. You can find me on Twitter at WillFast.
So what is it that we mean particularly when we talk about games as products versus a game as a service?
This might be playing into the nostalgia line a little bit too much, but I'm sure we all remember a time in our lives when buying games was a physically mediated process. When you purchased a game, that was a thing that you went somewhere to do, whether it was your EB Games, whatever crappy secondhand store was nearby that was selling like old copies of Conker's Bad Fur Day that didn't have a rating anymore, so nobody checked. But, regardless, buying games was something that was done at a place that was not where you played them. And in those days, I think games, kind of by necessity, had to follow much more of a product-based logic. You went to purchase a product the same way you would go to purchase a truck, the same way you would go to purchase any other piece of physical equipment or food or what have you, and you consumed it for all it was worth, giving a certain amount of hours of enjoyment, and then moving on to the next product.
Or you'd rent it.
Yeah, or you'd rent it and do something similar.
And crucially, like at that time, there was no internet.
Right.
Yeah, it was just
So
full stop. What you bought was all there was.
Yes.
There might be a sequel. Sometimes you could get DLCs for some games or add-ons, expansion packs, things like that. But it was just this disc, this cartridge. This is what the game is.
Yep. And I think the reason this podcast is on this topic is that we all of us in this room have noticed that the games that we are playing, the things that we enjoy playing with, the business models that undergird them wind up buying in much more to a service model where regular payments that are a little bit smaller than what we would normally pay for kind of a physically boxed product has become kind of the norm for these games. So we keep reinvigorating the games with kind of this renewability that's packaged as some kind of other purchasable thing that's usually delivered online, and so therefore we're less buying one product and playing it to completion, and more it's almost like a subscription model that gets reinvigorated every time something new worth subscribing to comes out. So the idea is that the reason why we settled on this is because basically we all mentioned a bunch of games that we were playing or thinking of playing or wanted to talk about, and the only thing that seemed to run between them is that this kind of works in all these cases. So Stellaris is a game that you've been playing a lot of lately, and I think Paradox is 100% leading the charge when it comes to this move towards games as service. They release like these empty skeletons of games and then throw DLC until they actually have meat on their bones. And then every game I play these days it definitely falls into that category. I'm playing Arkham, L5R, I play Stellaris. And then arguably like early access entirely. The whole practice of early access is games as a service.
Yeah, I wonder if it's just we're like looking at this is just a very transitional time for a lot of game companies, especially like this does fall like adjacent to the loot box stuff too, right?
Yeah.
Like, so yeah, and you see shades of that where it's like Destiny 2 is currently sending me emails about it's sending me emails referencing Sonic for some reason, talking about how things need to go fast.
That sounds like a personal problem more than anything else.
I don't know why Bungie is emailing me about wanting me to go fast, but like until they put Tails directly in that game, I'm not going to go back into Destiny 2.
Gotta go fast.
But you do see like they're referring to it as seasons.
Yes.
And like you've got the season pass DLC. Like part of that is just, hey, let's come up with a catch-all term for this glut of extra content that is added to this game after the fact. And two, it like I almost feel like in some cases it's almost pushing on the idea of like prestige television, like the idea that people are open to the idea that there's this new seasonal thing that they kind of commit their time to for a while and then go away from it. But I wonder how much of that language is kind of obscuring like the actual, like the idea that they're not necessarily one or the other, but largely just platforms, like smaller platforms functionally, as opposed to being a Steam thing. It's just like, oh, you just keep coming back to the Destiny 2 platform and we have you in our ecosystem and you keep coming back and we still see when like we're collecting data on when you come back and when you play and who you play with and all that stuff.
Sure. Yeah, no, and in fact I think that's an astute point. It makes more sense to think of games themselves as being platforms. Dota is a great example, right? Dota, it's less pertinent to think of it as a single game and more as a platform for multiple forms of game and spectatorship that are kind of focused on this one nexus, but which there's a vast number of forms of expression there from. I wanted to kind of tease out what you were talking about with the season pass language, though. I think that's really interesting because when you mentioned television, I think there's other parallels. Like, this language is not accidental. It's not for nothing. If you're trying to seasonalize or serialize the act of play and purchasing into play, sports also comes into it, right? You're almost purchasing a season pass to something that's going to transpire with or without you. And so you're either on board or you're not. And it's trying to sell more, perhaps the fear of missing out on this social process that's ongoing than it is an experience that is there and concentrated and will be the same for everybody across all circumstances.
Yeah, especially that like social aspect of things. Just wanted like the FOMO, the fear of missing out. I'm always very deeply concerned about this when sort of the Twitter sphere around games writers kind of comes out and there's like a new game and everyone's chatting about here's your God of War takes. And I think I like that FPS does try to stagger the content a little bit to kind of not necessarily completely undergird that stuff. But yeah.
How many years ago was it? I want to say it was maybe 4 or 5 years ago where every single game came with a season pass and a promise of incoming content. Like, you could buy Borderlands 2 Seasons Pass, and it was like the game had come out 2 years ago.
I don't quite remember because I feel
BioShock Infinite Season Pass. I mean, just the games I'm naming should tell us how long ago this was. But it was like you Fallout 3 Season Pass. Yeah. Like
Halcyon
everything.
Days of like 2010 to 2014 was probably like the peak of that, I think.
It was a very strange concept though, because it wasn't even like they didn't have product for a season pass.
Right. There will be product, we promise. Maybe.
Yeah, and you were just like, okay, sure, I totally trust that. I don't remember coming back to a lot of those things. It was just a very straight... we don't see that kind of language as much anymore. Are we just building that kind of expectation into games instead of trying to...
I still see like season pass bundle things and stuff like that, or like deluxe editions. It's just like, oh, it's an extra $50, but then you just get all the DLC.
I think what's happening here, I mean, we're talking about this, and I've noticed we're sliding very quickly into kind of like talking about it from a AAA perspective specifically. We're talking about very large companies moving from a much more product boom-bust cycle mode of production to this kind of service thing. But I think it would be instructive to try and think about this as perhaps just the other side of the coin to movements like the Kickstarter or crowdfunding movement, right? In as much as trying to prove that there's a market that's willing to pay for these things before they actually commit their full development budget to them is probably just a way of trying to be more risk averse. And even though it expresses itself as Kickstarter in the case of indies and small studios, in the case
of Atari.
Or Atari, or increasingly pretty much every studio ever. Does it not make sense to kind of think of this kind of season pass DLC, always on purchase loot box methodology as kind of like a Kickstarter for multi-billionaire companies?
I kind of make a distinction between like games that are designed with the intent of having a season, episodic games.
Right, so Telltale, for instance.
Telltale's a great example of that, yeah.
Life is Strange.
Life is Strange. Games that are sort of written around taking place over like, 5-10 episodes or whatever, or are having seasons versus like things with loot boxes where, what really changes except your hair or your hat or your gun skin or whatever, right?
More hats, infinite hats.
Like, I wonder, like, a lot of this stuff, these practices kind of escalated, especially sort of on the long tail of the last console cycle, where like consoles were a big deal going into EB games, and like physical copies were still a big deal, but like digital marketplaces were still kind of emerging. And trying to find like that next big sort of technical leap was sort of eluding a lot of those companies. Even now, like at the launch of like the PlayStation 4 and the Xbox One, there really wasn't like the next reason why you want to go and get this console. Like the games look slightly prettier, we can throw more shit in the air, but at a certain point, that was also when like towards the end of that console market changeover, like AA games like THQ basically folded. There was a market where you could get away with like putting out a middling to good shooter and still make money back on it. And that stuff became, the cost of developing those games became more and more expensive. And so instead, it made more business sense, rather than release more games, release one game, support it for a year, because you're not creating a whole new world. You're just adding to an existing platform, essentially. You're an existing set of tools and assets and stuff like that. I'm not saying that stuff isn't hard. Like, Destiny 1 ran into its problems because of the way that they built that whole world. There's a bunch of articles from Kotaku about like how troubled that development was and how difficult it was for them to even shoehorn new content in there because of the way that the maps existed.
I think for me, one of the games that I played the most that kind of got me into this seasonal, I would put it, engagement with it was probably Diablo 3. How long ago did that come out?
Oh, jeez.
I mean, I was getting my master's degree.
Century?
It was like 2012.
I was getting my master's degree, and it's still a game that is going because of its seasons. It's had a couple little bits and pieces of DLC and expansion things, but primarily people who play it for seasons.
Yeah.
And they're literally called seasons.
But that's Blizzard, like, the thing for me is, and the state of exception for something like Diablo 3 is that Blizzard has the resources where they can just, like, we're just keeping goodwill until we decide we want to release Diablo 4.
Mm-hmm.
And so, because that game launched and pissed off an incredible amount of people.
Yes, it did.
And like the auction market didn't really do what it was supposed to do.
Oh, God, the real money auction house, that whole debacle.
I don't know how well the Necromancer pack sold for them.
I don't know. Quip's got it. He played it nonstop for a week, and I think he's playing Stellaris right now.
Yeah.
So
I still main Necro, but I'm recovering Goth. So, but
Recovering.
like thing for me is like when you start looking at
they can't see quotes.
Yeah.
On the podcast.
They can hear them.
They can hear the sarcasm. I can hear the sarcasm. The idea that, like, are these actual services, or like, is there a kind of like a jingling the coins over or jingling the keys over here so you don't really notice? But like at a certain point, a lot of that stuff is setting up a promise that they'll never deliver on.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I'm sure Diablo 4 is not going to have just random stuff out there unless they build the hooks to make it extremely easy or with minimal amount of developer input to continue adding that stuff in there.
I'm in pain thinking about it.
Yeah. But like looking at, Capcom, the part of what prompted this sort of line of thinking for me was I picked up Monster Hunter World when it came out, and Capcom has always been really great about supporting that with a lot of post-release support and just adding extra stuff. But in this case, they're going above and beyond. They have an event right now where you're chasing down like a unique gold dragon thing, and it dramatically changes the way that game functions, and it actually turns into a bit of a loot game. In that, in a given instance, in a given, like, whenever you log in, whenever you matchmake into a server, there's a bunch of people playing, and they're just going and running missions or whatever, but you don't have to necessarily play with them at all. You can go and look out for like SOS flares from other worlds or whatever. Or you can go to this like gathering hub that has been largely like ignored by most of the player population. Go and join a very specific quest for this thing, and you're getting matched. You're joining other players within this server with you, and you're all contributing to this overall effect of like trying to chase down this monster. So at a certain point, you run a couple missions trying to kill this thing. If you fail, that's fine. You come back, but your rating on your contributions to this hunt kind of goes up, and your rewards are better at the end. You'll wind up actually just getting a bunch of loot at the end, which is not how Monster Hunter works. Monster Hunter is a game in which like the core loop is you kill ever more powerful monsters, and then you make weapons out of them. And it's as grotesque as you would think it is, but it's kind of cheerful. It's very weird. The whole tone of that game is
they're monsters, right?
Yeah, they're monsters. They're monsters. They limp when they run away, and I feel bad about that. Capcom is rolling this out. This is the first time they've kind of come to consoles with this that's not like handheld. Like, it's been on the 3DS for a bunch of while, but this is the like first major rollout on PS4. They've made a huge amount of changes to it, and they're realizing that they're like kind of hitting a certain buy-in, like a tipping point where they're getting a lot of audience. And so I think it's probably fine for them to take the loss on developing this new content for the game, in part because people are going to be like, oh, this is my expectations going forward for the Monster Hunter games. But I suspect the next one that they release is not going to have that same level.
Are there any loot boxes or kind of ongoing payments that you can pay into?
There's just DLC right now. Like,
just DLC.
It's just like you can go and buy a new haircut, or you can buy a Hadouken emote gesture, which I might have done.
So there we go. The hat economy lives.
Yeah, the hat economy, and that's like the only hooks that they currently have.
Right.
I'm surprised that they haven't done the loot box stuff, but that's probably because this game was in development long before that stuff really like struck gold in sort of console spaces.
It struck gold, but maybe now it's not. It's no longer striking gold for a lot of people.
The threat of legislation will do that.
Yeah, some countries in Europe are threatening development companies with jail time and that sort of thing.
Belgium, the massive economy of Belgium has decided to ban all loot boxes from all games permanently. That's a decision that they made.
It's not too hard to define what exactly is a loot box and how they do and don't fit into the sort of larger economy of like games as products and games as services and things like that. But like, what makes it a product versus a service?
I've kind of always seen sports games more as like a service, because like I'm never that type of person, but one of my brothers again, they can't see you, It's
You
a
can.
podcast.
Be glad you can.
Yeah. Pierson just made a lewd gesture.
One of my brothers would play like by whatever the New Year's Madden was and play that for the entire year, and then buy the one the next year, and then this was even before they offered like the ability to have microtransactions and that sort of thing. So I was kind of like people who can play one game for a year or years at a time, the same franchise.
But they're still buying, like, that's setting them up to buy the next one, right?
Yeah,
like it's still.
what's the difference between service and seriality then? Like, serial games versus, like, service games. Are games in a series games as a service?
I think we might be conflating kind of the platform of play itself to a product a little bit too much in this case, because I haven't thought all the way through this, but I'm going to say it anyway.
Yeah.
I think Will might be onto something with calling sports games, especially the ones that became notorious kind of in the late 2000s for oftentimes just changing the name of the year and then re-releasing it as a whole new,
The
full
character
product.
names are different too.
They update the
updated
roster.
according
The
to
character names.
trades.
Yes, and that is it, right? It's not that this is an entirely new product. It's almost like it's an update of a product that has already existed. It wouldn't be nearly as important to the people playing the game to buy the new one if they weren't playing the existing one. There's a sense of continuity between these games that I think is fundamentally different than games that come out as kind of like a story-based sequel. This is, I think it plays very much into this idea of sport and season pass kind of thing before such a thing was possible by digital distribution. So
Okay.
you could think of it as an update to the rules and the conditions of a pre-established playing field. But yeah, that's what I'm trying to say. I'm going to back Will on this one. And say
No,
that,
I get what you're saying. Like, functionally, you're saying if they had the technology when these sorts of games started, or the sort of always online platforms that we expect, you could probably just patch year after year after year instead of buying a full new game.
Yeah.
Is what it seems like you're saying.
And I think we're probably going to hit that point where I think I guarantee you there are people out there looking at, like, what if this is just a Netflix thing? Like, that is fundamentally my belief, and that's why, like, part of my line is, like, I don't think it's either of these things. I think that these two things are merging, and it's going to become just a platform, but we're not quite at the point. People are still in the practice of, I want my new game, and they're still updating engines, and they're still trying to optimize that stuff. Like, I think Destiny 2 is, at least Bungie's, like, originally when they were talking about Destiny, it was like, this is going to be a game for 10 years, and you're going to bring your character with you, and you're going to bring your inventory with you. And it's like, by the end of Destiny 1, everyone's like, I don't think this is going to happen. And then finally Bungie did come out and go, yeah, that's not happening. we can't keep carrying these gestures forward. No. And so ultimately it's just like, it's just like a facelift, and it's largely still Destiny, and it still plays really great. But the thing that for me that has been fascinating is, like, I played Destiny 1 like obsessively and just I didn't care about that game until I saw how janky and broken it was. And then I was kind of disappointed because Destiny 2 isn't really janky or broken, but it's kind of boring. Like, it's just like, I see where your monetization is. I see where your hooks are, and that's a bummer. And I'm super interested in pursuing that loop. And so then I just, like, have logged out. And until they put Tails in that game, I'm not going to go back to it.
You heard it here first, folks. Sonic needs to be in Destiny.
Yeah. I need to go fast with my buddy Sonic. I think Football Manager is probably a prime example of that, where, like, at a certain point, it's like, hey, you know what? Give us like $100 a year, whatever, like 20 or $12 a month or something like that, whatever, however you want to break that out. And we're gonna update the rosters. We're gonna, like, update some basic stuff here and there, but by and large, you're just paying us a monthly subscription to keep playing it. And it's funny because I think that's where they were hoping to go with the MMOs, and then that kind of collapsed on itself. But I think I wouldn't be surprised to see them kind of swing back around to that.
But I think that's a really interesting point that you just made. There's almost a different implicit contract in those two scenarios, right?
Yep.
One of the main things that I think was a draw for MMOs as a monthly subscription was the notion that the world was going to continue to evolve, more story content would be added. And even though there are obviously still a great number of diehards that are playing World of Warcraft after all these years and still paying for their account, I do think we've kind of reached a kind of a limit on what World of Warcraft can offer in terms of renewed play experiences by trying to, like, lump content onto this in kind of a narrative sense. But oddly and somewhat paradoxically, by slightly tweaking the quote-unquote rules of a game like Football Manager, you're almost reinvigorating the entire context of play in a way that World of Warcraft can't by adding more story content.
Yep.
Because you're almost completely refreshing, like, minor changes can completely upset the metagame of a game like Football Manager and make the game interesting and new and fun and janky all over again. And it does this. The real world provides the impetus for making these regular changes. pretty smoothly. So I think one of these two is far better adapted to this service model, and it's not World of Warcraft.
Yeah.
You know what's going to make me go back to World of Warcraft? When they release the vanilla servers again, because they're doing that. They're stripping down everything.
And isn't that
to put it all the way back? Yeah.
Isn't that fascinating? It's more interesting.
And I'm going to play again.
To you,
yeah.
to have a world that has less content.
Well, because they took a bunch of that stuff away when they kept adding more because they couldn't maintain it and people weren't using it and people were way too powerful to do it. So now they're like, obviously the best thing we could do is redo what we already did.
Yeah, Warframe, when they added their Plains of Eidolon, like the huge open world section, shortly thereafter, like 6 months or something like that, they pulled the raids. And the problem was, like, they lost a bunch of people that were streaming it and, like, deep on that game because, like, that's all they did. They only ran raids. They were only doing speed running and stuff like that. And at a certain point, they were just like, listen, we're not supporting this the way that we want to, and it's not functioning the way we want to, so, like, sorry, bye-bye. And then they kind of, like, lost a bunch of, like, I'm sure they gained a whole bunch when they did this Plains of Eidolon thing, but, like, they lost a bunch of people as well. We've talked a little bit about, like, a lot of digital games. How does Arkham Horror living card game? Before we go too far down this path, I was just going to say that, personally speaking, like, I played a fair bit of Android Netrunner, which is also a living card game. And I did find that, like, once I bought the base game, I was like, well, I should go and get that expansion. I should go and get that other thing. And it was like, at a certain point, I find that also when there's DLC on Steam, even for games that I don't play anymore, it's like, well, I own this game. Maybe I'll come back to it. And this DLC is just right there. And maybe what if I don't have the complete experience? What if I would like this game more if I had, like, weird AI people personas that I could play as in Netrunner instead of, like, Jinteki? So anyways, what are your thoughts on, like, how would that kind of relate, or how would this metaphor that we're kind of using in terms of, like, platforms or games as service, or how would you kind of apply that or level that at Android Horror?
I think it's more or less one-to-one. I think that we're seeing the exact same process occurring in game space as we are in physical card game space, analog card space. And this is present everywhere. I mean, with the serialization of board games as well, with, you know, constant expansions to them. I mean, this is occurring all over the place, but nowhere, I think, is it more pertinent or visible as in the LCG model, which, if you check through our archive of podcasts and also our articles, we have talked about at length elsewhere.
Pierson has talked about it.
Yeah, you
I
don't
have dominated conversations about it elsewhere.
They were good conversations.
Well, they were good monologues.
Yeah. Well.
Living card game. LCG stands for living card game, and that's it's no way to convey, like, a copyright or a trademark symbol verbally, but it's a form of game that was patented by
LCGs are like Magic the Gathering if it wasn't a gacha system, like if it didn't have loot boxes.
That's one way of putting it. It's a non-randomized distribution model for card games. But I think Magic the Gathering was what I was going to compare it to, because Magic the Gathering is another really good example of a game that, although you could argue right from its very inception was a service, I think it did try to use a more product-based model, or a more product-based logic in its distribution model, in as much as it tried to brand each new expansion that was released at the beginning or later on certain blocks as kind of being a narrative product, or it has some kind of cohesive theme that would define these product releases, of which there'd only be maybe 3 or 4 in a given year.
Which model are you talking about? Because they changed release models again.
Yes, they have proven to be very mercurial when it comes to
it turns out having 4 or 5 mini story blocks and expansions a year is quite messy, especially when they don't work together at all and people want to play games.
It's interesting that Magic is going through this kind of transitionary period in its release model right now, because I think that it made a lot of sense when telecommunications were less ubiquitous to have this more product-based release, where everybody would convene in the same social context in order to purchase this new product, get a whole bunch of randomized packs, because everybody's attention was localized. The trading was easier. You wound up being able to kind of build decks collaboratively. Well, not really collaboratively, but it was easier to trade around cards. There was liquidity in the...
And as Magic Online gained popularity, Magic's paper version tried to shift towards more of like a product prestige thing again. But people look at deck lists online. They watch the pros play in the pro tours. There's wide-scale broadcasting of games and things like that. And I think they tried to push product too high, and people really want a service.
Right. And so it seems to be an excellent parallel for what we're talking about elsewhere. Yeah. And Fantasy Flight, I think, has kind of tapped into this groundswell of sentiment, in as much as their games do not have any randomized product whatsoever. So when you purchase something, you know exactly what you're going to get. And the releases are far more regular and a lot smaller. So every month there's a pack of usually about 20 cards for each of their games. Some of them are competitive, some of them are fully cooperative. that kind of change or add something or usually completely reinvigorate the way that you play these games. And they happen regularly enough that people's interests tend to be stuck on them for a much longer period of time. There's less of a boom-bust cycle of whether people are interested and invested in the game, and it sustains them more over kind of a more regular but constantly shifting and in flux model.
I need more money. God damn it.
That's the title of the podcast.
Well, but I think you may have hit on exactly why this works so well. Arkham Horror, basically, you can bifurcate it into the parts of the game that you can have fun with in terms of trying to build a machine that you play with and does something to help you win the game or do well at the game. And the other half of the game, which is just trying to kill you or drive you insane, or those are the challenges that the game presents you with. And every time it releases something, every month, half of the release is some kind of new scenario that you're going to have to try and overcome. The other half are new tools that you can use to try and overcome it. But what we found in our playgroup is that not only does releasing a new scenario give us something else to do, something else to work on, it also provides us interesting new tools to go back and try earlier scenarios that we've already beat with different tools, with different concepts. And so oftentimes what we will do is we'll either go for some really off-the-wall, like try some very experimental decks that we've decided to try an easier difficulty, because there are multiple difficulties in this game. Mm-hmm. Or we'll go back and we'll try to basically min-max the hell out of something that we already know what's coming with it. So we'll choose like a block of 8 scenarios that form one narrative arc, crank the difficulty up to full, and just see how long it takes for all of our decks to fall apart, go insane, and explode.
That's super cool. And so, like, part of the thing that I was thinking of in asking this of you was also kind of gesturing a bit at, I think, Will, you were talking a bit about, like, Kickstarters and sort of indie developments. Like, a lot of the stuff that we've been speaking of is, like, was it you as well?
I'll take credit.
Okay.
It wasn't me at all, but I'm glad to take the credit. It was Pierson.
Okay. Because we have been talking about companies with a great deal of resources. And one of the things I've been thinking about is, like, people that continue to support games, even though it makes no financial sense for them to continue to do so.
You mean all of us in this room?
I mean, people who, like, developers who have created games and then release them into the world and then continue to support them. And part of that is sometimes just a goodwill thing. I think even from major developers, you'll see that, where, like, a game comes out, it doesn't sell super great. Like, Rainbow Six Siege, like, was critically panned and didn't necessarily sell super great, but sold enough. And then through continued support, they've managed to build, like, a pretty solid player base over the course of a couple of years. And it's this weird sleeper thing where, like, the games industry doesn't even, like, games writers and stuff like that don't even think about those games, don't even talk about them. But they have a very thriving community that continues to play them. Yes. And so recently, there's a very specific, like, indie kind of mobile game developer called Michael Bro, but he goes by Smeestorp. Michael Bro has made a bunch of stuff. He made Hack 868. Or 868 Hack?
Yeah.
Okay. Makes weird roguelikes most of the time. So he released a game on iOS called Imbroglio, which is sort of like a weird deck building game, like, but you're just building the play area where you move turn-based. So it's like you've got a bunch of tiles. They all do different things depending on what you're attacking, and then monsters come in from the corners. And, like, what happens is every time you pick up a star, there's, like, walls that kind of appear and reform. Yes, which is what I was playing on my tablet before we started. And because of the nature of this game, like, one, it didn't sell super great. Like, 868 Hack came out and did phenomenal for him. It was a huge success. It was a situation where, like, that wound up getting made and released on Steam. And then his follow-up did not sell at all near 868 Hack numbers and stuff like that. And so he released one bit of DLC to see if, like, that would reinvigorate it. And the thing was like, there were different characters that have different abilities. And at a certain point, once you get to, like, 256 stars or whatever, like level 256, like, there's nothing else you could do. You just basically beat the game with that character, with, like, whatever your tile set was. But it would open up for experimentation and coming up with weird and janky designs. And so he released a bit of DLC, didn't do what he was hoping it would do, and kind of moved on to other projects. And very recently actually went back to Imbroglio because he basically hit, like, writer's block, and then released a new bit of DLC in the past couple weeks. And again, it, like, adds some ludicrous stuff where I'm sitting there looking at those mechanics going, like, man, I have to go and replay it with all of these characters now. And, like, there made no financial sense for him to do it. It's this weird kind of, like, long tail sort of thing that he's kind of just coming back to when he has the time and interest to do it. But it is a sort of thing where, like, I feel like this game is less of a product and more of, like, a weird kind of service, but it functions in a very different way. And it's not positioned as in the same way as, like, a platform. So, like, trying to, like, talk about that sort of support, that post-release support that is not necessarily explicitly just, under the thumb of nightmarish capitalism.
Right, exactly. But this is dancing around an issue that I've kind of wanted to tackle head on, because it's something that we saw a lot. I did a bunch of research when I was back at Concordia on the games development industry there, because it's one of the largest cities for games development in the world. And one of the things that we saw, I was doing most of this research in 2013, was this very strange exodus that would occur. It was like this migratory group of developers who, every time a AAA game had reached the apex of its development cycle and hit release, they'd all get laid off from a large studio and basically go down to the street to the next studio that they knew was gearing up for a new development cycle for a large AAA game, get hired in, stay there for most of the development cycle, and then get laid off again once the game kind of went off. And even in the case of the very, very large studios like Ubisoft that were so large they had multiple projects on the go, the same thing was happening internally, where one project within Ubisoft would release, everybody would get kind of sort of laid off, quote unquote. And I forget what they called it, but they actually kind of had like a Ubisoft branded unemployment, where you would just kind of sit in these rooms and not do anything and get paid for it.
I've heard some chatter about that, whereas like it was like sort of a middle ground for like an island of lost toys in terms of
a limbo or purgatory or what have you for developers. But this boom bust blockbuster cycle, I think we were still very much locked in that in 2013. It's amazing how much things have changed in 5 years.
Have they?
Well, no, I think they legitimately have. I think part of this, and you can look at this from both elements in terms of like a support and mutual understanding and shared commitment to this game. You can look at it from that perspective, this new service ethos, but you can also look at it as from an exploitative point of view. And I think neither is invalid. I think they're both true to varying degrees, depending on which studios and which games you're talking about. But the point that I guess I'm trying to make here is that I think it makes a lot of financial sense, but also a lot of ludic sense for many games to move more towards this platform/service model. Because not only do players get to play around with systems that they already like more, they also, the people that make these games also get to be supported. It makes financial sense for them to continue to support these games as long as players continue to find them interesting to play. So there's no longer a complete disconnect between the success of a game and developers' ability to work on that game further. Because under the product model, it doesn't matter how well a game sells. The people that worked on it would still wind up getting laid off and have to move on to something else. It's just the people that owned the IP who would benefit from continued sales of that game or increased sales. But under this more service-based model, the people that were responsible for the game doing well in the first place or making it better after time, such as in the case of Rainbow Six Siege, directly see hopefully more benefits of that. Yeah. And then so do the gamers themselves.
I think that you do run into challenges where like this is it. I mean, you mentioned like it is a little bit more. It is a far more risk averse model, and I think that you do wind up running into situations where there are people on those teams that want to make a statement or like have some kind like at a certain point it makes ludic sense, but it might also destroy any kind of sense of like, oh well, because this is an Assassin's Creed game, we need to have like, here's your sneak up on this person hook, like a narrative reason for you to go and sneak up on a person, or a narrative reason to like use the mechanics that are already there. At a certain point, you are hitting the similar narrative beats, right?
The World of Warcraft problem again.
Yeah.
Oh, sure. Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
And so there's a challenge there, and I think that's why you wind up with situations. You wind up with fires where like the people who are writing about games, the people who are playing games, at least some of them, are looking at it as like, oh, we're also moving forward and trying to do like push this medium forward and do more interesting and new things with it. And we're looking at business models that are increasingly risk averse. Right. And that's why you wind up with a thing like Far Cry 5 come out. And like the original marketing pitch is like, we're going to talk about militias. And then everything following that, especially following like the election of Trump and you know, a million different political events and sovereign citizen things that have broken through the news. And then suddenly people are like, we never said that. I don't know what you're talking about. It's a Far Cry game.
Would you like several gallons of water with your political commentary?
Right. Yeah. Here's your wingsuit. I don't know. Like they hired a cult, just like the favorite, like go and read the interview that they had with Waypoint had with like the creative director or whatever, and also the person that they hired to like advise the Far Cry 5 team on cults.
What a job.
Because she was like, well, like sitting down is like at some point in time she was actually able to utter things, and I'm amazed that no one like basically just put a bag over her head and dragged her out of the room, because like her point was like, well, you know, like a lot of the ways that we talk about cults is like it's kind of sensationalized and like they're always drugging people up and blah 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 blah, and like all these are fallacies about actually how cults function. And so she's like, well, like when I was consulting during this process, I would kind of go into the writer's room and be like, well, how much do you want to learn about psychology? How much do you want to learn about cults? How much do you want to learn about how these things actually function as opposed to like the way that the media has told you? And then she kind of like pauses a little bit, or there's like a line break. And then she's like, but at the end of the day, it's like, there's still a kind of a limit of that kind of exchange, because at a certain point it still has to be a Far Cry game. And it's like this kind of like her like wah wah, like basically I told them all of this stuff was a myth, and then they were like, but we still need to make a shooty game. And at a certain point, it like all that stuff kind of collapses in on itself, because at a certain point you have to start reconciling those things with like a business model and people who are like super risk averse.
Sure, but maybe that's just the traditional product model running headlong into the end of its viable lifespan.
Yeah.
It's kind of like the main way in which we consume and talk about, think about games.
God, let's hope.
What is this podcast about?
We don't know.
Games as service, right? Okay.
Service and how they're
Product.
using products.
No,
No, services as opposed to
Have
products.
games service you.
Yep.
Pierson
made
has made
another
another
rude
very
gesture.
lewd gesture.
Jason is laughing over there.
FPS is hiring a new podcast editor. In addition to producing our podcast, they will be responsible for mopping our old one off the floor.
Half this podcast is going to be outtakes.
No, I didn't listen to the outtakes. I guess I stopped before then. Gotta go listen to it.